In the 6th century, St. Columba's ability to direct the winds was said to be a miracle for God. But in mid-century Scotland, women were being condemned as sea witches and put to death for raising storms. Many were women who were involved in the seafaring trade, who sold wind to stupid sailors. They were said to possess power over the winds, the weather, the seas, the tides, and even over the moon herself. If anyone who sought the services of such a witch refused to pay or offended her in some way, well, then she might destroy an entire ship or cause drownings. As you might imagine, superstitious seafarers, while they were afraid of these witches' great powers, even though they themselves tried to control the winds with all their rituals. And it was often these men who were responsible for condemning these women to death. Ironically, seafarers practiced magic and counter-magic. In Scotland, the shedding of blood was a powerful counter-charm against witchcraft. It was customary at New Year to shed blood into the sea to protect the boats. The burning of the clavey, an old Moray custom, was said to protect the boats against witchcraft, where they would also throw grains and spirits over the boats, make the sign of a cross with a burning flame. Many fishermen used salt to protect themselves against witchcraft. Some carried a pocketful, believing that a witch must count every grain in a man's hand before she could do him harm. If catches were poor, why, witchcraft was often suspected. To counteract this, fishermen would sometimes stick pins in a sheep's heart and burn it in a fire, believing that this would harm the witch who had cursed them and break the spell. Sometimes they would also prick the sails to injure a land-bound witch who would cause their ill winds. Some sailors believed that witches sailed across the sea on eggshells, so they rarely took eggs on board, and those that did risk it, they would put a hole at the bottom of the shell to prevent any witch from using it as a boat. As witches' familiars, cats were known storm raisers who carried gales in their tails. They were sometimes kept on ships to control the rats. But woe betide any seafarer who dared to call them longtails. There were so many ways that a witch could raise the wind. There was the untying of 3 knots in a magical cord, the enchanting of incantations over large bowls of water, the uncorking of bottles, the throwing of sand into the air, the carrying out of secret rituals, and the throwing of white stones into water. During the infamous North Berwick witch trials, the accused were said to hold their covens at a kirk on the seafront, and it was there that they dug up the dead, dismembered them, and tied their limbs to the bodies of dead cats, who were then thrown into the sea to conjure the storm that was said to supposed to kill the king. During that time, it was also said that witches would sail on the Firth of Forth in sieves of all things. During the Irvine witch trial of 1618, 4 people were accused of conjuring the devil, of throwing clay figures into the sea, which not only caused the sinking of the ship and the death of the provost, it turned the sea blood red. However, the accused would have said anything to stop the barbaric torture. Orkney had a reputation amongst sailors as a dangerous place to voyage due to the number of sea witches. Scotta Bess, a known storm witch who was said to sit upon a rock formation known as the Mermaid's Chair to cast her spells and sink ships, was so feared that one day she was seized by some Stronsay men who beat her to death with flails that were dipped in holy water. They buried her body in a field, but the next morning it lay on top of the soil. So they flung it in a loch called the Muckle Water, and it was there that they carried boatload of turf after boatload to place upon the body of the unquiet witch, and according to legend, this is how the only island on the loch was formed. So my final tale is a short narrative piece that I filmed for the conference about the story of a storm witch for the Isle of Lewis. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some facts, some folklore, and some folk tales. There was once a family from Barra. Every year, after they had gathered the harvest, they crossed the sea to Lewis afore the long frosty months of winter took hold. That year they stayed in a lodging house near Stornoway. The man of the family sat up late talking with the woman of the house. Just as he was about to get off to bed, a tall, thin woman entered the room. Her hair as black as a raven's back, her eyes cold and dark. She whispered something to the woman of the house, stroked her hair with her bony white hand, and then took her leave. "Who is that ugly black thing?" asked the man, curious about the familiarity between the two women. The woman of the house replied, "Is that what you see? An ugly black thing? Well, let me tell you this. You shall be lost in love with her afore you leave Lewis. That is, if you can leave the island, of course." With that, she stormed out the room. The man scowled at the thought of it. He had a lovely wife that was as fair and pink as the hag was black and ugly. He retired for the night, muttering to himself that the woman must be mad. When he awoke in the morning, the first thought in his mind was the woman with hair as black as a raven's back. Try as he might, he couldn't put her out his mind for the rest of the day. Later that night, the woman with the cold, dark eyes come to visit again. By now, he hated her even more, but a strange thing happened when she left that evening, for he began to long for the tall, thin woman like he had longed for nae other, with rage and desire running through his veins in equal measure. This went on every day for a week. All the while the man, he grew angry at his children and was cold and indifferent to his wife, until she finally begged him to take leave of that house. With his last shred of rational thought in his mind, he agreed. They packed up their belongings and made their way to their big boat, but as soon as the man set yin foot upon it, a storm began to brew at sea, and they could go no further. There was nothing for it. The family had to return to the house, and to the tall, thin woman with hair as black as a raven's back. Again the next morning they set out for the boat, but afore they could set sail, the mist drew around them and they could go no further. There was nothing for it. They had to return to the house, and that woman with the cold, dark eyes. It was then that they met an old witch with hair that was whiter than the down of a thistle.
"I see you hae a bit o' trouble leaving this dark place,"
she said.
"What will ye gie me for fine weather to go hame?"
"Anything, anything. I will give you anything," said the wife. All the while her husband's bloodshot eyes were staring at the house, his face full longing for the tall, thin woman inside it.
"A pound of snuff,"
said the old witch,
"and I will need to hae a word with the skipper o' your boat."
Later the night, the skipper went to see the old witch, who handed him a rope with 3 big knots.
"Take this on board, and you will have a good day for sailing the morrow. And if you dinna hae enough wind, why just untie ane of these knots. If that's still nae enough, untie a second. But whate'er you do, you mustna untie the 3rd knot."
The next morning the sky was bright and filled with a gentle wind. The family boarded the boat. Without a backwards glance they headed to sea, where the man of the family finally let out a huge sigh of relief. All the darkness disappeared from his mind, and his thoughts were pure once more. Glad to be free of the evil spell, he called to the skipper to untie a knot. So the skipper did as he was commanded, and a swift breeze blew up that set them cutting through the waves. "Untie another knot," the man shouted, and a great wind was let loose on the tiny ship, and they flew across the water with the sails stretched to their limit. The man felt safe from all danger. He bellowed, "Let us test the old woman's magic. Untie the 3rd knot." Of his wife, she begged him against this course of action, but the man, he didn't listen. It was his boat, so the skipper foolishly untied the 3rd knot. What happened then is a story for the ears of the fearless only. For out the sea arose the shape of a tall, thin woman with shining dark eyes and hair as black as a raven's back. Her bony hand reached down and plucked the man for the boat,
and they both vanished without a trace into the stormy sea. The boat ran ashore on the sands of Barra, and it is still there to this very day, to serve as a warning to those that are foolish enough to insult witches and think that magic can be tested.